There's a cult of ignorance in the United States, and there always has been. The strain of anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread winding its way through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. Isaac Asimov. Part of being able to think critically is learning how to evaluate research. So what constitutes research? Internet searches? Opinions of pundits on TV? Peer-reviewed studies? How do you know what to believe? Most debate and discussion these days seems to be based on opinion rather than fact. People have a tendency to believe what they want to believe regardless of whether or not there is any evidence to support their opinion. Unfortunately for these types, opinions are irrelevant unless they can produce evidence to back them up. This includes opinions from celebrities or politicians or people who hold doctorates in one subject while pontificating on another subject that isn't their area of expertise. Most often these opinions take the form of anecdotal evidence, where the listener is supposed to accept their say-so just because they said so. These anecdotal claims, whether they come from a single individual or a million individuals all parroting each other, are meaningless unless they're backed by facts, evidence, and research. So if someone is trying to pass their opinion off on you, ask for the research or the evidence that backs their claims up. Providing such research doesn't necessarily end the argument, but it is the first step. If they can't provide any credible evidence to back up their claims, then the argument is over. If they do manage to provide evidence supporting their claim, there are still several steps that their evidence has to go through before it can be considered credible. The gold standard on evaluating research is a double-blind, peer-reviewed study. In a double-blind study, you have a control group and an experimental group. The control group doesn't get the experimental treatment, while the experimental group does. So what does that mean? Suppose you have a vaccine that you're testing for a virus. Participants in your study are divided up into a group that receives a placebo and a group that receives the actual vaccine. These participants are randomly assigned to each group to minimize the chance that any bias could influence which participants get the treatment. This also assures that any biases the experimenters might have will be minimized. The group assignments are blind because the participants don't know which group they're in. So what makes it a double-blind study? In a double-blind study, the experimenters also don't know which participants are receiving the treatment. This is done to keep the experimenters from influencing the outcome due to their own personal biases. So how do we know which group received the treatment and which group received the placebo? One method that's often used is that each participant is assigned a number, and then the treatments are distributed randomly based on those numbers. This way, neither the experimenter nor the participant knows whether they received the placebo or the actual treatment until the study is over. At that time, the numbers are matched up to the participants and the results are evaluated. While double-blind studies are not 100% immune to mistakes being made, it's still the best method yet invented to assure that the results are accurate. Once the study is completed, the research staff evaluates the results to see if a treatment worked better than the placebo. If it did, then we can assume that the treatment is effective until proven otherwise in later studies. The peer review portion of the study comes in once all the data have been evaluated and the research is ready for publication. When a study is presented for publication, it must first undergo a rigorous process of peer review. In this process, people who are experts in the field examine the data and try to determine if it's accurate. They do this by looking at the potential ways the conclusions could be erroneous. In other words, they try to legitimately disprove the results of the study. If they can't, then the study has passed a peer review and is published. If they can, however, disprove the results, the study is sent back to the experimenters for further review. Does this mean that peer review is always accurate? No. Some possible threats to validity of a peer-reviewed study include whether or not the peer review panel has a bias. For example, you wouldn't want to take the results seriously if the study was being conducted on the dangers of smoking and the peer review panel was hired by the tobacco company. So if you're evaluating whether or not peer review study is accurate, the first step would be to ask whether or not the peer review study was double-blind. The second step would be to look at who examined the study. Who was on the peer review committee, and could they have possibly had any sort of bias or interest that would influence the outcome? If the study was double-blind and the panel didn't seem to have any biases, then we can tentatively say that the experiment was a success. Note also that this doesn't mean that the results are written in stone. There could be further experiments that disprove the results of this study, or errors could be found later by other researchers in the field. But the results can be considered valid until proven otherwise, or until more data comes in. In the next part of this series on evaluating research, we'll look at some other types of research and how to determine how accurate those results might be.